6-foot table talk. As we find out who walks the walk, it's the bane of our existence to practice social distance. 6-foot table talk.
Hello and welcome to 6-Foot Table Talk, a series bringing civil discourse and understanding back to the table. My name is Nigel Eastman and I am honored to be your host, but this series is not about me. This series is about the conversation. So let the talk begin.
Hi everybody, my name is Liz Applegate. I am a long-term member of the church and I was also on staff here at First United Methodist Church Plano for about 10 years.
And my name is Mark Lucke, and I have been on staff here since 1988, which makes me probably the longest term staff member here. I work in the music ministry. I'm the keyboardist and assistant minister of music. And we're here to talk with each other and with you today about the First Amendment, specifically as it applies to the right to assemble.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, it was very interesting, Mark, because I see that we both printed it out. So would you like me to read what that
Sure,
says?
would you?
Yeah, so I was glad that we both did that because it's been a long time since I've been in history class. So I wanted to know what we were talking about today. And the First Amendment reads, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances.
That's a lot of things covered in one amendment. And at first, I thought it was just a bunch of assorted stuff kind of junked together. But as I began to think about it, I realized that there was a common thread through all of that. At least it seemed to me. And what that common thread is, I think, is the Founding Fathers wanted to protect our right to express ourselves in public without fear of harassment or trouble from the government. And it's a lot of different ways of self-expression. The freedom of religion comes out of a background. Our Founding Fathers came from England, where if you worshiped in public and you were of the wrong religion, a different religion from the king or queen, you could lose your life. And other parts of that First Amendment probably were directed to their own experience of having the government abridge those rights or even persecute people in England for those rights.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to me, it really speaks to, we're talking, we are a member parts of this church, and, just us being able to have this conversation right now is actually part of our First Amendment right. And the fact that we have the ability to choose our faith or denomination, and we can do that here in this country without being persecuted, without being arrested. And I think of the countries even today where you cannot do that.
Right. There are probably countries in the world today where even what we're doing right now would be a really risky thing to do. And so I think a lot of times that's so much a part of our everyday life, we take it for granted when it's really something we should be grateful for, and that not every country can say they have. Right. So really what we're talking about is 5 basic freedoms: freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of what this amendment calls peaceable assembly, and freedom to talk back to the government, or if you will, to protest. I wondered as I was thinking through these, and let me ask you, do you see any, does the government or the law place any limits on these 5?
Well, I think that depends on who you talk to, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the first thing that popped into my head was, what I did find interesting is the First Amendment I always took to just be about speech, right? And so because I feel like that's the one that gets honed in a lot, this is my freedom, I can say what I want, and so, but when I look at the time where we are now and this past year that we have had, I'm reminded that we have the right to protest and petition the government for things that we feel are wrong.
Right.
What makes me sad is that, I'm not sure that sad is the right word, but what makes me concerned is that the protests now have been classified as being something that they're not. And like it's a bad thing, when actually it's very much the part of being an American.
Right. I understand that. Just to play a little bit of devil's advocate against that, though, is I think it's understandable why some people might be uneasy or even fearful as they see media coverage of some of the protests that have been going around the country. And again, that kind of gets me back to reflecting on, are there any legal or reasonable limits on these 5 freedoms? Like, for example, can we say anything we want to about anybody at any time? And I realized that wasn't true. You know, you can't say things in public that are untrue and damage a person's reputation. There are 2 kinds of laws to protect against that. There's libel laws and slander laws. Likewise, probably if your religion advocated some practice which violated a law, like if it was a part of your religion, for example, to sacrifice infants, that would probably not be protected under the Freedom of Religion Clause. Right. Freedom of the press and freedom of speech are covered, like I said, by those libel and slander laws. And freedom of peaceable assembly, I think the big qualifier there is peaceable, but that's probably worth having us talk a little bit about what peaceable means before we walk away from this table today. And then freedom to talk back to the government or to protest the government. The official language of the amendment says we have a right to petition the government for a redress of grievances. That's just a fancy way of saying you have a right to complain to the government about stuff the government is doing. Right. Sometimes, going on with what you just said, I do worry that because of some of our own fear and some of our own concern, we might want to draw some of those boundary lines a little early. Or because of some other features or side features of freedom of expression, we might be tempted to back down off of those a little bit. And I see that going on sometimes, and I think in a way that's just kind of sometimes ratcheting up the tensions on both sides. But talk with me for a few minutes, because I'd like to have this fleshed out. What does it mean, or is it obvious what it means, when the amendment says the people have a right to assemble peaceably? What does peaceably mean to you?
So when I think of peaceably, I think of, like I said earlier, I feel like that can be a term that is very subjective, right? Like even you and I could have this conversation on what peaceable means, and it could mean different things to each of us. So to me, it means It means doing things that is not causing harm or destruction. But as I say that, and as I hesitated to say that, and maybe I'm jumping ahead, but I think of times when there were peaceable protests and no changes were made. And so at what point does it become more? And what point does it need to become more to petition the government for grievances? Right. And so I'm hesitant to define what peaceable means, because I understand there's just a greater impact of all of that. Right.
Well, let's start with the easiest case and go to the more difficult cases. Okay. Obviously, some of the easiest cases would be an example of a worship service. Mm-hmm. Nobody's doing anything unpeaceful, hopefully, or violent. And it's obvious that we should all we should all be able to do that, even if, as a member of First United Methodist Church, I disagree with the doctrine of St. Mark's Catholic Church across town. Nevertheless, we all affirm, both the members of that congregation and this, that we should both be allowed to assemble peaceably and worship. So that's an easy case.
Right.
Other kinds of cases that I think are real clearly peaceable would be, for example, a pep rally for a sporting event, or a political rally where people cheer for and cheer on their candidate. There are plenty of those. I don't think we have to belabor the point any further than that, but those are assemblies that really I think aren't controversial. Even though maybe political assembly in the old world, back in England, where our forefathers came from, that was possibly not protected speech.
Right.
Anyway, it gets a little bit more dicey when assemblies are protests. Then you have a bunch of angry people calling out for change or for justice. As long as that's all they're doing, that should still be protected under the First Amendment, right?
Right.
Now, here's the situation that Liz was talking about. Yeah, and I got to tell you a story because it goes to, I think this has to do with human nature, and I sent it to her in an email. Okay, so my wife is sort of the chief administrator in our household, just because she's more efficient and more organized than I am. And so every now and then she'll ask me to do something, and of course I'll say, oh yeah, I'll do that, and I won't do it. And some time will go by and she'll say it again. After the fourth or fifth time, she gets to the place where she pretty much explodes at me. And then she gets angry at me for getting angry at me. And she says, why do I never get any results from you until I have to yell and get ugly about it? In the moment, probably what I do is mutter under my breath and go do the chore. But it makes me think, isn't that just kind of like human beings? You know, don't we tend to sort of let things go if it gets said nicely to us? You know, I'd really like you to do that change. And somebody else says, oh, yeah, right, that's really important. We'll have to do that sometime. Well, there are a number of things that people are protesting about right now that they feel that they have asked nicely for many times. And these are not trivial things. Right. Please put artificial sweetener on the table along with the sugar so I can keep my diet when I'm drinking iced tea. It's not like that. You hear people protesting over situations that are causing people to unjustly lose their lives, unjustly be discriminated against in ways in which any of us in calmer moments would say, yeah, that's not right. And so now we're thrown up in a dilemma. Some people, like my wife, when I don't listen to her, get ugly. And they get ugly in ways that sometimes involve destruction of property and sometimes even involve violence. Right. And I feel like you and I would both say, you know, the violence and the destruction of property is not acceptable. It's not acceptable even if their cause is a legitimate one. I mean, we just can't have that. There'll be anarchy in the government, anarchy in our society. And so I understand people's fears about that. But you can understand why people are thrown up against wondering, well, what am I going to do?
Right.
What is it going to take?
Right. I mean, the frustration after a while is here we've been peaceably protesting, assembling, having our grievances be heard, and nothing's happening. And I think for me, that's where I might not understand getting to that level of frustration, but I feel like that's the opportunity for me to step back and listen and learn.
Right.
It's not my job to judge that, and it's certainly not my job to take few instances and then turn the whole protest into what that is.
Right. Yeah, and we do that. And I would probably shade it a little bit differently than you, but I think you and I probably agree on this. I feel willing to judge the actions that are illegal and destructive, but I am not really quite as willing to judge the person. First of all, because Jesus says, judge not lest you be judged. But second of all, I think I think doing all the judging is just setting up a huger black and white, and it seems to me that we're missing the point. And the point, like you said, is trying to understand what is it that has driven these people to doing these unacceptable things. Are they just that way? And probably some people do just show up to create mayhem. But some people probably find themselves into carrying on into actions that they shouldn't, because they're so caught up in the sense of injustice and outrage. I always like to make the difference between understanding someone when they do things that are not acceptable and excusing. I think you can understand somebody without excusing them. And I guess that's what I want to try to do when protests get violent. I want to try to understand, to see if there's something that we can do to address what's making them, what's causing them to drift over into unacceptable behavior. And I do that without excusing the destructive or the violent actions.
Right. Well, and I know when we were talking about this, a lot of times change has to happen when the voices get loud enough to people start paying attention. And that's really been part of our history. You know, I look at the women's right to vote back in the early 1900s, and there were protests, there were arrests, there were policemen coming in and beating women, arresting them. There were hunger strikes. There were all these things there, and that was what that part of our history happened so that we could have the women's right to vote. There have been other things throughout history that have had to happen that way.
Right. We were talking earlier during revolutionary times. The Boston Tea Party is usually something we teach kids in history books with an aura of pride. But if you stop and think about it, the revolutionaries were destroying property. All right, it wasn't there. That tea wasn't theirs. They were angry at the injustice of taxation without representation. And yet, when we look back at that moment in our history, our primary feeling about the Boston Tea Partiers is not that they destroyed property. Right. It's that they struck a blow for justice and freedom. So it's kind of a mixed bag. Let's go even farther back to that. Now, although this one's maybe a dicey one. Remember when Jesus ran into people in the temple who were selling? He overturned the vendors' tables, and he braided up a bunch of rope and drove them out with by whacking at them. That's Jesus himself. Yeah. And I think we can only look at that and say there are times when a cause is so important that it goes to extremes. Now, I think we have to be real careful that we don't get self-righteous with that. Well, my cause is so just, I'm entitled to break the law. And at the very least, if you choose to break the law, you have to be prepared to accept the consequences. Just like in the 1960s with Martin Luther King and with actually Gandhi in India, where they began to stage what they called passive resistance protests. Right. They were ordered to move, and they just stood or sat or lay stock still, and the authorities had to drag them off, and they didn't put up any protest. That's arguably a more peaceful, less destructive way to protest, but it still does involve defiance of the authorities. Right. And generally speaking, we look at Gandhi and we look at Martin Luther King and their way of protesting as righteous and even appropriate ways of protesting.
Right. Yeah, and that's, so I'm real hesitant to even talk about this, I'll be honest with you, but here we are, we're talking about it, so let's do it. I think of other examples of peaceful protesting. Colin Kaepernick kneeling at a football game. It's a peaceful protest, yet it wasn't acceptable. So when we're talking then about protesting in the streets, I mean, the culmination of, okay, we tried peaceful protesting in other ways, songs, just in many various ways. And so at what point is it no longer a peaceful protest because peaceful protests weren't acceptable, weren't working.
Right. Yeah. And that way of putting things, that way of asking the question throws me back against the dilemma. I just can't go the route of condoning violence. I can't. I can't even go the route of condoning destruction of property, even though our revolutionary forebears did it. But that leaves us with an uncomfortable open question. When people who experience injustice ask nicely and get nothing in the way of results, what are they supposed to do?
Right.
Are they supposed to just go on about their business and accept the injustice and say, well, we tried and it didn't work? And honestly, I'm asking that as an open question because I don't know the answer. And I think it's an answer that we're going to have to all come to together as a society, whether or not we support the kinds of protests.
Right.
And I do want to drive home because I've heard it within the last week and I've read it on Facebook. People conflating the idea of looters and creators of violent mayhem with protesters. And I've heard people accuse various political candidates of making no distinction between rioters, looters, destroyers of property, and committers of violent mayhem and protesters. And I just think that's unfair. For a political leader or a political candidate to hold up our right to assemble and demonstrate is not only legitimate, it's enshrined in the very First Amendment.
Right. Right.
And so I think it's important that we make that distinction.
Well, very much so. I mean, that was when I read this amendment that really struck out to me.
Right.
You know, it's just that part is a very important part of who we are as Americans.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, our producer is telling us we're out of time. I just feel the need to close with the fact that Liz and I are united in telling you not to go down burning buildings, not to go hurting
children.
people, but to recognize that protests are protesting against injustice, and we would all benefit from recognizing injustice where it occurs and asking, how can we make this better?
It's a great closing, Mark. Thank you.
All right. Thanks.
6 Foot Table Talk.